Welcome, students and citizens of the world on YouTube. Today I'm going to be looking at real American heroes, destroying the myths your history books told you about those evil robber barons. So let's first start off with what you're going to hear from in most history classes in America. Basically, it boils down to when the free market system allowed monopolies to emerge in the 19th century, the Interstate Commerce Commission was created to control them. Or you can insert any other of the things you're going to learn about that the government did to supposedly stop this monopoly and horrible business practices. My favorite historian, Tom Woods, has a sentence that I love. He had the first sentence too. He says, "I love that sentence. It has fourth grade written all over it. As in, you see, children, our wise overlords, when they saw greedy people taking advantage of the public, did just the right thing, as usual. Without them, we'd be living in the streets begging for food and at the mercy of men with white mustaches carrying money-filled sacks with dollar signs on them." So this is kind of what is portrayed to students. I think most students coming out of a U.S. history class, this is basically the overall message they're going to get as to how this period of history unfolded. So I'm going to present kind of a contrarian view of this history today. And the first thing I always hear in class is, why should I care? So, well, here's the point, is that this is going to affect everything you do in your life, everything our country does. So every student's going to leave high school with the view of the free market and government. Due to the nature of textbooks and many teachers in this country, most students are only exposed to one way of thinking, which will leave them with a negative view of the free market and believe government intervention is the only way to solve problems and make our lives better. You're going to carry this out, and other students are going to carry this out when they vote or pick politicians or vote on rules and laws. The issues raised in this video can be expanded to almost every aspect of your life in government. Jobs, money, homes, family, hunting, guns, anything you buy. You as a citizen will help to decide how these issues will be resolved in the future. And you can actually see this type of stuff happening today in newly formed industries like the craft beer industry, internet, vaping, Uber, Lyft, anything in the rideshare economy, and states that have legalized marijuana. So here's kind of the steps that kind of happens in history and with government. And kind of break it down, it's called the 5 steps of corporatism. So large corp could be anyone, can't compete for customers, so it lobbies the government to regulate its industry. The federal regulations impose rules on large corp that they wanted. They planned for it. They knew they could afford it. But a lot of their competitors, especially the smaller ones, can't afford it. So now they can buy them out, or they go out of business. Now large corp grows into megacorp. Now it can afford to buy out other competitors. So people start to say, well, megacorp's too big, we need the government to regulate it, and then they demand more government regulation. And this just keeps repeating itself over and over again in almost every industry that we have today. So here's kind of the big idea. And when I talk to my friends on the left, a lot of them will agree corporations are in bed with the government. And we agree that's a bad thing. But then their plan to solve this issue is that we need more government to regulate them. I don't understand that logic. Another one is kind of anytime something goes wrong in the economy or the government is to blame capitalism. Capitalism is purely simple, just free markets. It's the exchange of goods and services without coercion or violence. So when you start to use coercion or violence, it is no longer capitalism. Now we have what a lot of people call crony capitalism or corporatism, which is not a free market. One of the biggest problems here is something called regulatory capture. It's a pretty highbrow term, but I think you guys can understand it even if you're in high school. So here kind of is how it goes. So I agree. A lot of my friends on the left will say the corporations own the government. And I say, yes, they do. And then they say, and they need to be regulated. And I say, by whom? And they say, the government. And I'm thinking, but that doesn't make any sense to me. So we have Scumbag Steve here, says he hates the free market. And then, so I'll hear this from my left too, and they'll cite instances of regulatory capture where people from an industry go into the government to regulate it. So I could do this with almost any industry, and it's done by Republicans and Democrats. But if you look at it here, on the top right, we have the federal government and Goldman Sachs. That's a bank. So you can see there that all their CEOs eventually end up coming and working for the government to regulate Goldman Sachs. You can find the same with Monsanto with food and farming. You can go to big oil. You can go to defense contractors. You can go to almost anything, and you'll see a revolving door of people going from whatever industry they're in, going into government to regulate that industry, and then they'll usually leave and become lobbyists or go back and work for that industry again. And I hope we can all agree this is a bad thing, but we keep letting it happen for some reason. Big businesses want more government regulations to keep out the competition. So I just have a couple examples that I think kind of always blow my mind. One is the Obamacare regulations. If you look on the far left of that first chart, you'll see the actual text of Obamacare. But then you add the regulations and you're over 2 million words. You look at the cumulative number of rules. We're up to over 170,000 now in the government. It takes time and money to follow those rules. That's what big government wants, so that smaller competitors cannot enter the market or they're forced out. Even just doing our taxes has almost gotten impossible. There's like over 74,000 pages of the IRS tax code. How we're supposed to comply with all that is beyond me. But it allows the government to cut up and give special tax breaks to certain industries, and that's why they do these type of things. And you can also see the Obamacare regulations are 7'3" tall, which is taller than LeBron James, which is just astronomical, and we wonder why healthcare is so expensive. So now let's get down to the heart of the matter. What did these evil robber barons do? Rockefeller takes the price of kerosene from $1 to 10 cents. So is that helping the rich people, or is that helping the poor people who want to be able to see? This time in history, people wouldn't even use lights most of the time at night if they were poor. And it wasn't until he brings down this price that people are actually able to use the evening to get stuff done because of the light. Oil goes from 58 cents to 8 cents a gallon, thanks primarily to Rockefeller. So again, they're making things available to everyone in the economy at a cheaper price, so we have a better standard of living. So the first thing your textbook rarely ever mentions is that they act like these guys can just raise and lower prices willy-nilly and just drive out competitors. That just did not happen at all, especially when there's a global market. So they ignore this. There was a huge Russian-American oil war that started around 1885. And this this forced Rockefeller to get his prices even lower. He had to sell his oil for 5.2 cents a gallon, leaving almost no profit margin if he hoped to win the world. And he did this. So this was a really interesting story, but just for time's sake, can't go into it. But essentially, Rockefeller ends up beating the Russians, and kind of American oil is the gold standard during this time. The other thing is that monopolies do not exist without government. And even when they try to break these up, it doesn't really stop these supposed evil rich men from getting money. So for instance, after Standard Oil was forced to dissolve because of the federal government, Rockefeller tripled his wealth in the years following that decree. Why did he triple his wealth? Well, Standard Oil had a new oil that made gas 80% cheaper than it had been. Another one here, and this is actually from a real economy peer-reviewed article. Robert W. Crandall and Clifford Winston find little empirical evidence that past interventions have provided much direct benefit to consumer or significantly deterred anti-competitive behavior. So when we go back and actually look what the government was trying to do, essentially they did nothing. It didn't help us, it didn't help competition. It was essentially just a way where these businesses wanted to restrict competition and got the government involved, because the government ultimately has the force. What about this evil guy, John D. Rockefeller? Well, he gave away $540 million before his death in 1937. That's more than any other American before him ever had possessed. He gave that much away. He created two of the world's greatest research universities, helped pull the American South out of chronic poverty, educated legions of African Americans, jump-started medical research, and dramatically improved health around the globe. It's not surprising that his biographer concluded that Rockefeller must rank as the greatest philanthropist in American history. What does he get for this charity? He gets demonized in almost every U.S. history textbook in the country. It's a great quote from him saying, think of giving not as a duty, but as a privilege. And there were many of these so-called robber barons, or as I call them, the real American heroes, who had this view. What about Andrew Carnegie? He is going to almost single-handedly reduce the price of steel from $160 per ton to $17 per ton in less than 20 years. The amount of expansion that this allows in America, I can't even really explain to you. So think of all the railroads and the canals and the bridges that are being built at this time. That doesn't happen if the price of steel is $160 per ton. It only happens, and we all benefited, at least the past citizens of America did, when the price of steel is dropped. Carnegie was so efficient, in fact, that the 4,000 people who worked at his Homestead plant in Pittsburgh produced 3 times more steel than the 15,000 workers at Germany's Krupp Steelworks, Europe's most modern and renowned facility. So that is what gave Andrew Carnegie's edge. That's why he was able to get this money. He was so good at being efficient and using what was at him to make the best product possible as cheap of him. How evil of him, though, to do this, to bring the price of steel down. But what about Cornelius Vanderbilt? In 1798, the governor of New York had granted Robert Livingston and Fulton a monopoly on steamboat traffic for 30 years. Vanderbilt was hired illegally to run a steamboat between New Jersey and Manhattan in defiance of that monopoly. He evaded capture while at the same time charging only a quarter of the monopolist's fare. So again, I think this is another example of where the government tries to come in and actually the free market beats them. And it's not even close when you're beating somebody by charging 75% less than them. So Vanderbilt soon became known for his sharp business acumen. During the 1830s, he built profitable shipping lines in the New York region, undercutting competitors' fares and offering top service. What a jerk. Who does this guy think he is? Cheaper prices for all. He must be stopped. So after Gibbons versus Ogden, which is a very famous case, overturned the New York steamboat's monopoly, he continues to drop the prices. So just a quick summary. These are real prices. New York to Albany went from 7 to 3. New York to Philadelphia, 3 to 1. New Brunswick to Manhattan, 6 cents and free food. Hudson River, he charged 10 cents. Later, he drops that entirely and just lets people ride for free and makes money off selling food and concessions on his boat. So he's maximizing his profits. He's bringing down prices. He's making these steamship trips not just capable for rich people, but now even poor people can start to benefit from this advance. So how does Harvard historian Tom Woods summarize these robber barons? These men were able to acquire such substantial portions of their industries because they consistently produced goods at low prices. When they stopped innovating, they lost market share. The cartoon version of events notwithstanding, that's kind of what your history book teaches you, competition was vigorous. It was only after voluntary efforts, pools, secret agreements, mergers, and the like failed to stabilize this highly competitive environment that some firms began to look to the federal government and its regulatory apparatus as a way to reduce competition coercively or using force. Ironically, contrary to the consensus of historians, writes Gabriel Kolke, it was not the existence of monopoly that caused the federal government to intervene in the economy, but the lack of it. So there was so much competition, businesses wanted to get the government. And that's my summary. Businesses hate competition. They want to get rid of it. They don't want to deal with it. It drives down the prices and makes them produce a better product. They realize only the government has the power to limit it. And that's why they started getting the government involved and lobbying for these types of things that you're going to hear about in this chapter. So in your history books, predatory pricing will come up many times. And the idea was that these businesses were doing this and the government needed to step in to stop them. This is just pure propaganda. Thomas DiLorenzo says that, but in more than a century of looking for a proven real-world monopoly actually created by predatory pricing, an example has yet to be found. Moreover, prices charged by the 19th century trusts continued to fall for more than a decade. What rational businessman would continue to price his goods below cost for more than 10 years? In summary, the 19th century trusts were not guilty of the charge levied against them by Senator Sherman. There is no consistent evidence that they restricted output to raise prices. But did they use it to undercut competition? According to the congressional record, they claim there was 19 areas where these businesses had monopolies. So even during the House debates, even the people that were for government getting involved said this. William Mason, trusts have made products cheaper, have reduced prices. But if the price of oil, for instance, were reduced to 1 cent a barrel, it would not right the wrong done to the people of this country by the trusts, which have destroyed legitimate competition and driven honest men from legitimate business enterprises. So they admit products are becoming cheaper, prices are going down, but supposedly this competition, the government needs to step in and save this competition. No matter how much, gas for a cent, the government's going to step in and apparently intervene and not let that happen, according to William Mason. It took me a long time to find this, but I'm a very data-driven person. So I finally found these supposedly monopolized industries, and you can look at this yourself, but basically I highlighted a couple of them. So you can see steel goes from 1.2 million tons in 1880 to 10.2 million tons in 1900. So in 20 years, we almost have a 1,000% growth in this industry in their output. So again, this whole idea that they're restricting stuff, they're charging these prices is just not true. The other one that your book, almost every history book, will praise Ida Tarbell and talk about how she exposed all these corruptions of these supposed robber barons. And researching for this video, I found this out. I had never knew this in all my history I've ever learned and taught. And this was just from history from Pennsylvania. Tarbell was far from objective. Her father was one of the small entrepreneurs Rockefeller put out of business in the Pennsylvania oil fields, and her brother William Walter Tarbell was an executive in the Pure Oil Company, Standard Oil's leading competitor. In addition to financing his sister's education and career, he also gave her much of the ammunition she used against Rockefeller. Tarbell demonized Rockefeller and included inaccuracies in her account. She was right, however, about Rockefeller's power and ruthlessness, and his willingness to bribe legislators and drive competitors out of business. So again, this lady's just hailed as some do-gooder who is just going out there exposing these corruptions. Well, if Standard Oil is doing such a great job, they put your dad out of business, I understand you're upset, but that doesn't mean that they're evil. Her dad actually made barrels, and Rockefeller found a much better way to transport oil than using barrels, and he went out of business. So again, just think of this. She's not coming from an objective standpoint whenever your history book will praise her about how amazing she was and blah, 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 blah. But just understand, basically, her brother is financing everything she's talking about them to eventually, since they wanted to destroy him. Yes, but what about those evil railroads? Now, I will have to say that I'm wrong, right? Let's find out. So the U.S. had 4 major railroads. Every one except the Great Northern was subsidized by the government. So surely those ones must be better. Let's find out. So the libertarian or non-governmental approach here was done by a guy named James J. Hill and the Great Northern Railway. You can see where it's kind of grown to eventually. Kind of starts out in Minnesota. So who are the real enemies? The government-subsidized railroads. So the government wants to get this railroad done, so it tells these railroads it'll pay them 16,000 miles per track on flat land, 32,000 on hilly, and 48,000 in the mountains. So where do you think they decided to build them? So again, this is just the government causing more problems. So what incentive or unintended consequence did the government create with for paying them by this structure? And again, this is just going to start what is corporate welfare or crony capitalism, where all these businesses are going to come to the government and say, we need you to do this, we need you to do that. But in reality, what they're doing is they want to get more money. They want to restrict competition and drive out their competitors. They know that only the government can do that. We're not done yet, though. So what incentive did the government create? Well, when you're paid by the mile, these railroad builders start to build winding circular roads to collect for more mileage. They laid track on the ice and snow, and it ended up costing taxpayers and the government much more money. Some observers estimated the actual building cost at almost 3 times of what it should have been. So the Great Northern gets its start when the Northern Pacific, the government-subsidized railroad, goes bankrupt, and it did not take them very long. As we just talked about, the government subsidies and land grants were issued on a per mile of track basis. So Cook and his cohorts had strong incentives to build as quickly as possible, which only encouraged shoddy work. Cook and his associates were considered derelicts at best and thieves at worst. So people did not like the government subsidized railroads because they didn't care about people or their customers. They were getting their money from the government. So what makes James J. Hill a hero? He stresses the importance of crop diversification to the farmers. He provided free seed grain and cattle to farmers who had suffered in droughts. He donated land to towns for parks, schools, and churches. His model farms educated farmers on the latest developments in agricultural science. All of this generated goodwill with the local communities and was also good for business. So he took the approach that we all have to be successful and grow, or none of us are going to be able to do it. So again, he has to battle this crony capitalism then. James J. Hill detested politicians and politics and paid little attention to them. Things were very different with the UP, as Folsom explains. So this is what the government subsidized railroads were doing. What were they spending their money on? Were they helping the farmers and everyone in the community that they were to try to help them in their lives because we're all in this together? No. What would they spend their money on? They're going to spend their money on lobbying government and getting more handouts from the government. So this is just an example of something that happened in 1866. So they hired an orchestra, a caterer, 6 cooks, a magician, a photographer. They served Chinese duck and Roman goose. They were offered roast ox and antelope. All could have expensive wine, and for dessert, strawberries, peaches, and cherries. After dinner, some of the men hunted buffalo from their coaches. Durant hoped that all would go back to Washington, inclined to repay the UP for its hospitality. And this is exactly what we see today. Congressmen and legislatures going on expensive vacations or getting money or just giving to their campaigns. They want something back. There is no better return on investment than bribing the government. You get way more money back than you actually put in. There's nothing else even close. Advertising, endorsements, investing in the government and getting them to do your bidding is the number one way to get ahead. So in conclusion, the free market and capitalism beat the government and crony capitalists. Hill's Great Northern was consequently the best constructed and most profitable of all the world's major railroads, as Michael P. Malone points out. The Great Northern's efficiency and profitability were legendary, whereas the government-subsidized railroads managed by a group of political entrepreneurs who focused more on acquiring subsidies than on building sound railroads, were inefficiently built and operated. Jay Cooke was not the only one whose government-subsidized railroad ended up in bankruptcy. In fact, Hill's Great Northern was the only transcontinental railroad that never went bankrupt. It's called checkmate. So the summary for the real American heroes. We have a drastic cut in prices for all goods. Extreme increased production of all goods. The free market outperforms the government-subsidized businesses in almost every example. billions of dollars given away in charity, as well as foundations that actually solve problems. Products and services that were once luxuries only for the rich were now so cheap they had become necessities for the working poor. Monopolies cannot exist without government force. Businesses hate competition and will do whatever they can to stop or control it. Government intervention did little to nothing to help consumers or fair competition. And again, like I said at the beginning, you're going to have to make decisions about how this country is run and the policies that we implement. I think most students graduating from American high school today are not given a full and accurate detail of history. So the question you're going to have to answer yourself sometime in your life is, do you want to favor more of a capitalistic society, or do you want to favor a more socialistic society? And there's many things in between. But again, I'm trying to give you as much evidence from history to support a free market capitalism where we are not using violence, we're not using the state to force people to do things. To me, that is the goal of liberty.